So let's get started, I guess, with a bit about what we're talking about today. So most people today are familiar with virtualization and how we do it. I mean, whether using VMware, HyperV, the IBM products, lots of different products out there that will allow us to virtualize our operating systems and so forth. I mean, I think the most popular, of course, is the VMware, which I also use in some of my client corporations. But here we're here to talk about the Microsoft virtualization in this course here, and how that could be a cost-effective measure for people to create their servers this way instead. So we're going to talk about that for the next little while in this webinar here. And as I said, Adrian or anyone else who joins in the future, of course, any questions, please don't be afraid to ask. You can stop me in the middle of a lecture. Don't wait till the end because you might forget your question. So I don't mind any interaction here in this webinar at all. So our subjects here, a couple different things. I'm just going to talk about the various Microsoft virtualizations that we have out there. HyperV being only one of them, of course, the cloud being another one, for example. We'll talk about different ways that people can actually virtualize. Then we'll get into HyperV more precisely. I'm actually going to just show you a bit about the interface in HyperV from a Windows 7, 10 perspective, and then from a Windows Server perspective, because HyperV is a product now that comes in not just server operating systems, but also client operating systems. So we'll see generally how this will save you money by me talking about some of this stuff. I won't just wait till that slide or that section of the webinar to talk about cost savings. I'll talk about cost savings throughout the webinar entirely. And then I'll introduce a little product called VMM, the Virtual Machine Manager, and talk about that can help you furthermore into automating and saving you money by administrating your VMs. Okay? So let's go forward here. So, I mean, we have quite a few kinds of virtualizations out there. We're talking about server virtualization, desktop virtualization, network virtualization, user state presentation, app v cloud computing. And I mean, if we look at virtualization as to what it is basically, it's taking an operating system, and instead of putting it on a bare metal computer, we're going to create basically an environment for it. We call this the virtual world, and we create an environment for it in a virtual machine where it's going to be simulating access, if you wish, to all the hardware, the processor, the memory, the hard drive, networks, whatever is considered as hardware in there that's relevant today, right? That can simulate it. And it can also introduce additional simulations. For example, I can simulate having multiple network cards. I can simulate having multiple hard drives. So it's not just simulating the existing hardware that's there, it's basically adding to it, and pretending that you have this additional hardware. So in this way, you can simulate any kind of physical environment by not actually having to purchase that physical environment. A good example of that, which I'll get to a bit later on, is of course clustering. Clustering is a very expensive investment, if you wish, when it comes for hardware, if you want to do hardware-based clustering. And so more and more we're pulling away from that hardware-based clustering and we're going to software-based clustering. Because like I said, the hardware-based clustering based on the SANs and then the SCSI connections and all the various hardware to get to be very, very expensive. So if I can, create a high availability environment by using virtualization instead, and it's going to cost, I don't know, let's say 1/10 of the price that you would normally do with a hardware-based clustering, right there, you've got a 90% savings, okay? So virtualization is there to simulate environments and make it so that the user doesn't know the difference also. So this should be totally seamless to the user. The user, whether they're using a physical server or a virtualized server, physical network, a virtualized network, right? The user should not care about this. The user should not know about this stuff. So again, we're not going to be changing any of the ways that the users tend to work. Let's go forward here and talk about these different virtualizations. So number one, of course, is server virtualization. Right? This is I'm just going to demo mode here. Go on to I have a server back here that I'm working with, and so this server back there already has a bunch of virtual machines using the HyperV software that will allow me to run different. Well, for me, I teach a lot of courses, and these courses have virtual machines that they're using, or I have my production environment here, my SCOM server, my SharePoint server, my SQL server, right? These are all considered as, you know, server-based virtualization. So they're not actual physical servers. I've got one server back there. It's a very powerful box, has lots of memory, lots of CPUs, and so forth. But I'm running about, at any one point in time, half a dozen virtual machines, sometimes even up to a dozen virtual machines, depending on which courses I'm teaching. So, and it also allows you to isolate basically those operating systems. If some of those applications don't work well together or causes a security breach, you know, we have a complete isolation here on these virtual machines. So this is an example of server-based virtualization. So we have multiple operating systems on one physical box. Host servers share resources with all the virtual machines. So basically, you know, those virtual machines, as I said, have one physical box that's sharing all its resources to those VMs. But now, let me just, sorry, I'm going to go off track here for a second, folks. We talked about, a few years ago, we talked about, you know, how the US corporations were using their physical servers and how they were using their resources. And the statistics came out a few years ago that were showing that in most US corporations, the majority of their servers were being used at less than 10%. So those resources that, you know, you've purchased, that you spent, let's say, $100,000 on the server, and you're using 10% of that, you're wasting $90,000. Or if it's a cheaper server, if it's a, you know, a $50,000 server, you're wasting basically $45,000. So when I talk about sharing resources for the virtual machines, we don't want to be buying anymore today one computer per app or one computer per service. That is a complete waste of our money. We want to make sure that we are maximizing that investment on that box physically. Okay, so it's a pretty expensive investment. So as I talked about for the Microsoft world, we talk about HyperV being the software that Microsoft has been developing now for a while. This is now in its 5th version. And that's what we use to create our virtual machines, okay? We basically allow ourselves to what I call detach the computer hosting, okay? That service there from the hardware. So as I said, I can virtualize, I can simulate, if you want, any of the hardware that is either present on that machine or that is not present, doesn't matter, okay? I can do a full simulation on that. We talk about the server workloads. So since we're talking about server virtualization, you probably want to be creating some kind of a server-based application or a server service. I could be virtualizing, for example, my domain controllers. That's more of a service, right? The directory services. I could be virtualizing my databasing server, my SQL server, my Oracle server, right? That doesn't mean Microsoft. You can be virtualizing any software. So basically allows me to have all my workloads, you know, completely detached from my hardware. And if I want, completely isolated from each other. Okay, that's very important there also. So that means that you will need less physical servers, okay? I can buy bigger servers and put lots of virtual machines versus having one server, you know, that has just one service or a few applications on it. That means you're going to probably be investing more money, but you'll be saving that investment. You'll be saving a lot of costs on that because you will not be wasting the resources. You'll be maximizing the resources on that server. Okay, that's really important. Now, also, what I don't mention too much in this course here is the energy. Let's talk about the energy that you're using. You know, that all of your servers do require power, right? We have to feed those, even though you can set up the different power savings on those servers. You know, to save you a bit of money, as long as one application is using that hard drive has to spin up again, eventually, right? So by having less physical server, you're using up less of the electricity around you. You're saving the environment. We're saving that whole global warming theory. Very important to us now. So it's not just cost on the investment. Initial investment is the cost that you'll be saving on the electricity, okay? And of course the air conditioning, the power supplies, and so forth and so forth. So this is an example of server virtualization. We talked about HyperV here, and I'll get back to that a bit later on. Now we also have a concept called desktop virtualization. Basically, the applications or the virtual machines comes down to the client computers. Now, do not get this confused with the server VMs, because see now here I have my Windows 10 computer, and if I actually go and get my HyperV software here, so I actually have the HyperV that's running on my client computer, okay? But this is not what I'm quite talking about here. This is another example of a server virtualization, where on my Windows 10 I can have some virtual machines running. This is one of the courses I taught a few weeks ago, okay? And so that's not quite client-side virtualization. Client-side virtualization is when we actually take, you know, the virtual machines that are sitting on the server and we send them down to the client. An example of that is when you folks do your labs virtually with some companies like Labs on Demand or Learn on Demand, and those labs are sitting basically in a data center in Toronto or in New York or in, you know, Seattle or whatever, and we access those virtual machines by using a Internet Explorer, you know, or a web browser, and that's an example of desktop virtualization. Okay. So we have different ones here. So we have the client-side virtualization. We have the VDIs, okay, the virtual desktop infrastructure as an infrastructure. And so basically, again, to the client, whether they connect using, you know, to a virtual machine or to a server using the remote desktop, like I'm doing over here. Sorry, this is a remote desktop session to my my server back there, which I'm showing you the actual HyperV, or whether they're using a software like you know, a web browser to connect to that virtual machine, which then simulates more of the client side. Doesn't matter. Either way, you know, the client itself is not running any of the resources, so you can have a very light client. You can even have a tablet that's accessing a full-fledged desktop, you know, application like the complete Office products or some more sophisticated softwares like, for example, AutoCAD softwares, right? So with the desktop virtualization, the servers are taking most of the grunt of the work, and the clients can be very light clients and, you know, still running some very powerful software. So this is the desktop virtualization. Network virtualization, I put this slide in here because network virtualization is also part of the virtualization world. I mean, in my, well, this is, I'm in my home right now doing this presentation. I actually have one physical network, but if you look at my HyperV system back there, and I actually go into my server, I go into my virtual switch manager, I can actually create multiple networks. Okay, depending on which course I'm teaching, I can have 4 or 5 networks in here. So virtual networks are a bit like, you know, subnets, if you wish, or a bit like, you know, physical network where you completely isolate them. So, you know, here I'm talking about, you know, we have 2 virtual machines on a physical server with a physical network. So these virtual networks would simulate, let's say, switches separating all the packet communication that's being done from virtual network A to virtual network B, right? So virtual networks are really important today because we do want to isolate some of our servers where they only need to be part of a certain clientele base or whatever, or they'll only be talking to each other, right? So virtualization for your networks is also very important. And this is very easy to do. All the stuff I'm talking about here is very simple to set up in the Microsoft world. Okay. And then we have, of course, what we call user state virtualization. This is a bit like those roaming profiles that we used to have, but it's funny because initially here in my home, I have my wife and I who use computers a lot. She is able to work from home sometimes. So I've initially created some virtual, some remote profiles that are stored on a server. And so when she logs in, doesn't know which computer she logs into, she can access all her work tools and connect to her work environment. But now when I reinstall, right, when I change the operating system to a newer version, I was basically massacring her tools. And so with the user state virtualization, I've now for her created, you know, these virtual machines, these virtualized environments that I never touch. So her work IT helps her to configure that machine. And whenever she needs to connect to the office, she just connects from, you know, she goes into the virtual machine and then she connects from there. That virtual machine, I've saved that, I've backed it up for her, I never touch that. And so basically that's user state virtualization where you can have the consistent or the consistency of their settings all the time. And this is very important also. We have other things here, like we talk about here, HyperV applications, which I'll get to a bit later on, remote app applications. And so Microsoft has different virtualization services for that is sitting on the server side that you can install, and that can do that for you. Okay, so this is kind of a replacement to those roaming profiles that we still use today. I'm not going to say we don't use them anymore, but you know, kind of this is a replacement for that. I'm going to probably end up just giving her a virtual machine because that's going to probably be easier, and I'll just keep a certain operating system on there. I think now in her department and in government they're using a Windows 7 based VM or Windows 7 based operating system. So anyways, that's something else. Then of course we have the presentation virtualization. We talked about remote desktop services that you can install. This is the old, you know, TM server that we used to have in the old days, the terminal services server. Okay, so the remote desktop can work in one of two ways. Remote desktop to display the entire desktop, which is what you're seeing here, of course, right? So I'm displaying the entire desktop on my server in the back end, and you can also be using remote app. This is just to display, let's say, for example, my Word application. For that, I have to install the remote app services on the server. So either way, you can display the entire desktop, but if the user doesn't want to be overstimulated by that whole desktop, you can just give them an application, okay? And that's a bit less confusing for them. And of course, you can use also, you know, tablet-based devices like Windows RT, excuse me, or other non-Microsoft devices. Again, those applications that are running on the server can be so demanding that their tablets or their local computers normally would not be able to run those. So another cost-saving measure there, folks, of course, is that you don't have to purchase for every one of your clients, or should I say your employees. You don't have to purchase a very powerful computer anymore. By having all the software run remotely, you can purchase for them a small tablet, a small laptop with only, you know, 4 gigs of RAM, maybe 8 gigs of RAM if you're nice with them, if they want more memory. So anyways, it's really depends on what you know, what the users need. So we have, of course, HyperV. So HyperV basically allows us to completely virtualize applications from the client's computer. So in other words, they actually run on the server but are thrown to the client as the client needs to access it. So a great example of this, of course, is all the Office products. If you want them to install them locally, you centralize the installation on the server. Right there again, folks, a cost-saving measure by centralizing the application on the server. The updates, you know, the upgrades are only done there once. They're not done on every single client computer. So if you've got 1,000 clients accessing that server, you don't have to update 1,000 different computers with that new product version. You simply update the server with that version. So that's actually pretty cool there. Another huge cost savings measure. You guys know, of course, how extensive it can be to upgrade every client machine in the office, whether you have, you know, 50 computers or 50,000 computers, doesn't matter. It is quite a task to plan that and deploy it, obviously. You can also be simulating, if you want, any kind of application that can be represented by an MSI file. So most applications that are MSI based can be deployed or, you know, sent to the client computer as long as the client will support MSIs, which is supported ever since Windows XP or whatever it is. Okay. Anyway, so this is kind of another powerful feature where you want to have every application centralized. And of course, then there is cloud computing. We actually gave a cloud-based webinar about a month ago discussing all the advantages of the cloud. So quite a few advantages of the cloud, and there's also some disadvantages. The major advantage, and this is where every company has to do a calculation on the cost savings measures. The major advantage is that Microsoft, you know, in this case using Azure, Microsoft is hosting all the hardware. Microsoft is doing all the hardware maintenance, doing all the backups. So all the hard-based infrastructure is managed by that corporation. All you need to do is decide, okay, do I want to be using, let's say, just the Office products, using the Office 365. We call this basically software as a service. Or you can be saying, oh, no, I have my own virtual machines. So I want to be putting my virtual machines into the cloud because I don't want to have to buy these expensive servers. So I could put the virtual machines into Azure, that's platform as a service, or I could be saying, no, I don't have my own virtual machines. I just want to use, let's say, the SQL server portion of the cloud, and that's infrastructure as a service. So again, because you're just using, that what you need to use from the Microsoft, you're only being billed for that, right? You don't have to invest heavily into a $50,000 server. You're using their servers. Of course, the downside to that is that you do have to pay that monthly fee, and that ranges from a few dollars a month to literally tens of thousands of dollars a month. You just got to pay that little fee, to have Microsoft host that infrastructure for you. Okay. Now, I'm talking about Microsoft here, but you can also be using private clouds. So I had a client of mine actually out of Victoria a few years ago. We started this project about 2 years ago. And so he's a psychiatrist, and so is his wife. And they began a private cloud for all of the psychiatrists in Canada to share resources. And so, and he sells this, of course, and lots of different services in there. So he began this private cloud, so that he can control the hardware, he supports that, he maintains that. But all the doctors, all the psychiatrists around Canada do not need to have their own servers, their own whatever. They use his private cloud for that. Another example of a private cloud, of course, is government. Our federal government here in Canada has created a new department called Shared Services, and Shared Services is actually, well, they're supposed to be centralizing all of IT, from all government departments into one area. And that's another private cloud, for example, for the federal government. I know the U.S. government has the same plan going on the last couple of years, and it's kind of going well, but it's got a few hiccups that they need to iron out. We also talk about the hybrid cloud, where you can actually have your own on-prem servers talk to the cloud and use resources in the cloud, and share those resources. Anyways, so I won't go into much details on cloud computing because we've actually had this webinar, like I said, a few months ago, or last month, sorry, and you can actually refer to that webinar off our website and get a hold of that. And but that definitely, there's virtualization. We talk about virtualization today. We talk about cloud, because to me the cloud is a big virtual environment that I don't see anything in there. That's all the company taking care of it. I have no clue what they're doing in there. Well, I do know how Microsoft works. I visited their center before, but it's supposed to be completely transparent to the user, of course. And I am one of the users of Azure. So as I mentioned, this is all different virtualization softwares. HyperV is the Microsoft server virtualization software. As I mentioned, it actually comes on a server environment, where this is a Windows Server 2012 R2 box. I have my HyperV services installed. You install this as a feature. And so this server can be hosting multiple virtual machines, as you're seeing here on my screen. I've got multiple virtual machines. These are my production machines. They're actually for my corporation, and this is another machine running here. I've got all different courses that I teach. I actually run them off here. But now the courses that I teach, I can actually, as I showed you earlier, run them on a client-based HyperV. So this is my Windows 10 HyperV, and so I can also be using this here. And let me just go to my server because I got a few more things to show on the server side. So it's very easy on the server side. I'm getting ahead of myself here, folks. I do apologize, but it's very easy to create new virtual machines. I mean, you simply say here, new virtual machine, right? And you simply give it like a quick name. Let's pretend I'll be installing here a virtual machine for a new SQL server for testing. Okay, you give it a name. You need to actually store, so the way that Hyper-V works is a bit like VMware. It actually stores everything onto a hard disk. Okay, and I'll go next on that. Now the thing with Hyper-V, as of a few versions ago, they've introduced generation 2, and so we have generation 1, which is the traditional generation that allows us to simulate the computers in the old days, like 15, 20 years ago, with like diskette drives and all that good stuff. But generation 2 is actually much better, much faster, much more secure, but you have to be running a more recent operating system to support Gen 2. So, I mean, people who aren't quite sure will always be choosing Gen 1, But for me, I choose Gen 2 for most of my virtual machines because they're running 2012 R2, 2016 server. These are 2016 servers that are running here. So I will choose Gen 2 for now. And with Gen 2, you don't have all the hardware that you used to have for Gen 1. For example, for Gen 2, you do not have diskette drives. That's not there anymore. In Gen 1, you still have those. In Gen 2, you don't have any COM ports and so forth. So if your application or your operating system does require some of those older hardwares, then you'll need to stick with Gen 1. You give it the amount of memory that you want. As of a couple of versions ago, they also introduced dynamic memory, where traditionally, if I would give it, let's say, 8 gigs of RAM, it would take up from the server 8 gigs of RAM, and it would not give anything back. It would just, no, that's my 8 gigs of RAM, don't touch it. And now with dynamic memory, the memory is actually adjustable. So I can live, as the VM needs more memory, it'll grow to use more memory, up to a maximum of, let's say, 8 gigs. So I like to keep things pretty static. I mean, I have enough memory on my server. I can actually afford to have lots of memory here allocated to it. But anyway, so I'll just keep it right now for static, 8 gigs. Your next step, of course, is to configure networking. This is my live connection onto the internet. This is a private network that only the virtual machines on this network can see. So usually I like to do my updates initially and all that good stuff, so I'll usually go live. Then I specify a hard drive that I want to be using for this, and I'll just leave it to the defaults, okay? So typically this hard drive will be, in this case, the operating system, have all the files, the applications on there also. I can use an existing hard drive, or I can attach one later on, but I like to have one created right away for my machines. And if I want to install an operating system right now, I can actually go and get an ISO file. Okay, so I can get one of the ISO files, let's say for Windows Server 2016. And that way, when I boot up this virtual machine for the first time, it's going to boot up like as if it would have the CD in the drive. And I just hit the space bar, right? It loads the operating system, I install it, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you can do that now if you want to. And there's a quick summary. So I want to actually create this. I create so many machines, I don't need to create any more. And so what that does is it creates a virtual machine. Okay, you have my domain controller here running currently. And afterwards, you can actually just go into the settings. You can change, well, right now it's running, so I cannot quite be adding just any hardware that I want to. I can be changing certain values, like memory is not dynamic, so I cannot change that. Okay, I'm giving one processor to it. I could give it more processors. Okay, it depends again. I mean, right now I think my server vector has 16 processors. I can actually give it 4. Okay, I can simulate different SCSI controllers. I can also add new hard drives here. Okay, when the machine's not running. Actually, well, I can when it's actually running. I can just say add hard drive, add DVD drive. Okay, and then of course I can add additional network adapters, or even change the existing network adapter. Okay. I could use VLAN IDs, okay, if you understand that, you'll understand what those do. And then there's additional management stuff down here that I want to go into in this course here. We do go into it into the virtualization course in a few weeks from now. But, I mean, this is how easy it is to configure the virtual machine. And then, of course, when it's running, you can just go into it. Right now I'm already logged in, okay. And, like, this is the actual virtual machine. I can also connect to this. I'm going to close that for a second. So I'm going to say remote desktop connection. That was my DC, DC1. It's on server 16. And I will log into it. So right now that virtual machine is created on my server. But I can log into it with remote desktop. I've enabled those services, obviously. I want to talk about another cost-saving measure here, folks. Here's my virtual machine, by the way. You see, did you guys see how fast it was for me to set up the environment for the virtual machine? So for me to deploy a domain controller to a bare server, a bare metal server, would take me on average, let's say, an hour. A domain controller, an hour and a bit. With a virtual machine, if I create one from scratch in a virtual machine. I did it a couple days ago, actually. It took me about, without the updates, 10 minutes. So another cost-saving measure, deploying on a virtual machine, okay, 10 minutes, an hour, 1/6, you know, or a fraction, if you wish, of the time that it takes you to install on a physical server. Wow, big savings measure there. Okay, so HyperV basically is that. Okay, whoops, and I can also install Linux on there, Windows operating systems, doesn't matter. Okay, amazing how fast I can do this, you know, using VMs. So far we've seen that we save you money by using hardware investments, reducing those hardware investments by a lot, and then using instead one bigger server with many machines on it. You see that the deployment time is quite faster than if I do it on a physical server. I didn't talk about backups yet. With backups, I can back up that disk. Remember that VHDX file I created earlier? I can back that up. That backs up the entire server. Okay? And I can do this live while the machine is alive, while the machine is running. Okay, that's pretty cool also. Clustering. Since I don't have to invest in hardware clustering, I can save myself the money by doing software clustering. Wow, seriously. Okay? And this is just something that I've been saying in the webinar so far. Now, we have other softwares like the Virtual Machine Manager, which allows us to manage, deploy, clone, backup, you know, all your VMs, whether it's HyperV, Citrix, VMware. So with these software like VMM, if I'm managing, let's say, 1,000 or 10,000 VMs, this software will make my life much easier. With these kinds of software, I can create a template, let's say. I create a template for an SQL server. And then when I deploy an SQL server in the future, I just use the template. I say, here, use this template, deploy. I walk away. 2 minutes. Not half an hour, not an hour, not 2 hours, 2 minutes, I walk away. So with software like VMM, you can do so much automation, administration, and so forth and so forth. I can even manage my virtual machines in my cloud that are sitting in the cloud. Okay. I can also use software like the System Center. I can use SCOM, the System Center Operations Manager. Okay. I can use my Backup Protection Manager. So all of the System Center tools can be used to help me with my VMs. Okay, it's amazing. So when I only have a couple dozens, I don't want to use VMM for that because that's more of a setting up, you know, to set it up and all that good stuff takes time. But when I have a couple of hundred, couple of thousands, couple of tens of thousands of VMs, you need to have a tool like this to give you a hand. Okay. So, Adrian, there's only yourself here so far. No one else had a chance to join our webinar. So from here, if you are curious to find out more about, you know, Hyper-V, SCCM, SCOM, Data Protection Manager, VMM, you can actually take this course here. So course 20409 allows you to learn more about virtualization, how to configure it, you know, automate it, all this good stuff. So that is a great course to consider, which is being held in the middle of September. Was it September 18th, I think, that week there. So great course. I'll be teaching that course to get you guys to know more about this. All right. Any questions, Adrian? You've been pretty quiet there, but I'm not sure if everything is okay. Any questions? Okay, if there's no questions, I will stop the webinar here. And Adrian, I invite you to go to the Web Age Solutions website and to find out more about future webinars, to download the webinar here and review it if you want, or to register for the course coming up in a few weeks. Okay, in about a month, I guess about a month from now. We're only middle of August so far. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, and hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we'll talk to you all soon. Bye now.